Welcome, everybody. Just so you know, we are recording this session. Not sure what we'll do with that recording afterwards, but hopefully it'll be of use for our Ford program, just so everybody knows. Welcome to the latest of our Ford research seminars. This one on drinking tea with the neighbors, something that sounds so incredibly inviting and civil for our times today. I'd like to do it myself. But this one is actually about informal clubs and social trust and trustworthiness in Mali. Our main presenter today is none other than our own Jaimie Bleck, Associate Professor of Political Science, Senior Research Advisor at Ford, and as you all know, one of the main pillars of the intellectual and academic work that the Ford program has been doing. We also, though, have the privilege of having with us one of Jaimie's co-authors for this paper, Jacopo Bonan, who's joining us, I assume, from Italy, where he is assistant professor in the Department of Management, Economics, and Industrial Engineering at the Politecnico di Milano, as well as an affiliated scientist at the European Institute on Economics and the Environment. And Jacopo will join in particular, on the question and answer part of this a little bit later. Jaimie, Jacopo, welcome. Thank you for being here and for the presentation. I can say up front too that afterwards, if you want to pose a question or make a comment, you can feel free either to use the little blue hand that you get from the when you click on the participants button at the bottom of your screen, and I'll keep track of that queue. But if you prefer to just post a question in the chat in writing, I'd be glad to pose it to our presenters today on your behalf. So again, the floor is yours, Jaimie.
Okay, let me set us up for a screen share here. All right, great. So thank you all so much for joining this morning. I know many of us are operating on minimal sleep, and it's a hectic time in the semester, so I really extra appreciate people coming out. But I'm excited to present some co-authored work. As Paolo said, it's on drinking tea with the neighbors, informal clubs, social trust and trustworthiness in Mali. So it's a co-authored project with Jacopo Bonan, who will be joining us in the Q&A, Philippe Lemay-Boucher, who many of you might remember was a Kellogg Fellow here a couple years ago. So an extra thank you to Kellogg Institute for brokering this relationship, because I wouldn't have met Philippe except for the fact that he was a fellow here, and Bassir Osar, who's finishing up his PhD at the Paris School of Economics. I need to thank the Kellogg Institute for funding for this project, but also USAID, the Scottish Institute for Research and Economics, and Heriot-Watt University. All right, so today I'm going to be talking about generalized trust and trustworthiness and civil society in the Global South. And I thought it's important to start off just with some definitions. So when I speak about generalized trust today, we think about trust and the act of sort of making ourselves vulnerable to others, a very relational term. When I speak about generalized or social trust, what I mean is trust towards others in our political community. So trust towards other citizens, rather than an in-group or particularized trust of just, in this case, members of my social club. So I wanted to put that on the table and I'll also just highlight this distinction between trust and trustworthiness. They're a little bit different, right? So if we think of trust as relational and trustworthiness as more of how you act towards others in order to demonstrate that you can be trusted. So promise keeping, telling or assuring others that you won't betray them. Those are the two central concepts that I'm going to focus on today. And so there's literature, right, within political science and sociology coming from social capital that suggests that there's a really important, or there could be a very important determinant of generalized trust and trustworthiness as an outcome. And that determinant is associational membership, right? And so it's not a membership in any club or group, but it happens to be a membership in groups that could bridge different types of people together, different networks, in order to generate this generalized trust and trustworthiness. And so to date, most of the literature on social capital, the theorizing, and also the empirical tests have come from Europe and from the United States. And there's been relatively little work looking at associational membership and generalized trust and trustworthiness in the Global South. So that's what we want to do today. And we want to do that for a couple of reasons. We want to focus in our study there. Here we have a picture of one of the 2 research sites, the lovely city of Bamako. We want to come to Bamako because we suspect that one, it's not hard to imagine that generalized trust and trustworthiness might be even more important, right, for the functioning of society in a place where the state is weak, where where institutions aren't doing the necessary backstopping to facilitate cooperation. And the second reason is that we know that civil society, associational membership in general, plays a huge role in substituting for or sometimes complementing a weak state. So we think that, hey, this is where the action might be if we're looking for incubators of social capital. But to date, most of our literature on civil society in places like Mali tends to focus on homogenous groups. So ethnic associations, religious groups, village development committees. And so in those contexts, we don't necessarily see the bridging across different networks in society that's required to generate this kind of generalized trust. So just a word on Mali before we jump into the research design and all that stuff. So Mali is a low-income, weak state in West Africa. A lot of you might have seen it in the news in terms of talking about the current insurgencies, rising intercommunal violence, presence of jihadist groups. But something I want to underscore is the fact that if you look at Afrobarometer data, Mali is actually a relatively high social trust environment, at least compared to the rest of sub-Saharan Africa. And we can trace some of this generalized social trust to pre-colonial governance mechanisms stemming all the way hundreds and hundreds of years back to the Malian Empire's constitution, the Gouroukan Fouga, which I can talk more about in the Q&A. So actually, because of high general trust in society, it becomes a hard test to look at individual variation in generalized trust and trustworthiness. But that's what we're going to endeavor to do today. All right, so as I mentioned, we're interested in a relationship between associational membership, particularly in diverse informal clubs, and these outcomes, generalized trust and trustworthiness. And I want to highlight a couple of things to sort of make an appeal for why this is an important question. One is that while there's been a lot of theorizing on social capital, associational membership, and trust, there isn't actually a lot of empirical support that shows the link between membership and trust. And I'd say that's for a couple of reasons. One is sometimes the types of clubs that we're looking for don't have the frequency of interaction or the salience needed to generate these kinds of positive externalities. The second thing, which I'll talk about in greater depth later, is just this measurement dilemma of how do we deal with endogeneity? How do we deal with the fact that it might just be that people who are more trusting and more trustworthy self-select into civil society, into associational membership. And thus, when we see that they're acting in a more trustworthy way, we can't really separate that out from their personal characteristics from any kind of work that group membership might have done. And that's a problem that we're confronted with in the study, and we try to grapple with in a couple different ways that hopefully I can convince you are meaningful. The second thing I want to highlight is that membership in groups, right, especially in the context of Mali, which is currently facing heightened insecurity, there's a lot of literature that suggests that membership in groups creates in-group solidarity to the detriment, right, of out-groups. So can create discrimination and mistrust towards the other while we emphasize solidarity and trust among us. So in that sense, if we can identify specific groups that are still creating generalized positive trust, that would be a really interesting finding, especially, as I said, in the context of Mali today. So last, really, I guess, moving from the point that I just made, group attributes are key, right? So it's not any group that could just create generalized trust and trustworthiness. It's groups with these specific characteristics, so the specific ability to bridge across groups with loose, or they're sometimes referred to, weak ties. And to date, I think one additional problem with a lot of the literature on social capital is it tends to measure, if you look at political science anyway, tends to measure these things on with survey questions like how many groups are you a part of and what role do you play? Are you a leader? but not necessarily the characteristics, the composition, and the functions of the groups themselves. So in this study, we're really going to dig into this black box of what's going on inside associational membership. And we're going to do so looking at Gran. So those of you who've seen me talk about these things before, I've been working on this project for a while, might have heard of Gran, but for those of you who haven't, Gran are these neighborhood tea drinking clubs, predominantly composed of youth males, where guys get together to drink tea, talk about politics, but also their personal problems, and sometimes cars and girls and other topics. But they meet with high frequency, and they're forums for exchange. And we think that these might be good potential places to look at as venues or incubators for generalized trust, because they're characterized by four components that the civil society, the social capital literature tells us is important or are important. So first is, rather than being very vertically structured groups, these are very horizontal groups that present egalitarian forms for discussion. So later I'll show you some focus group quotes, but members emphasize that when they're a part of these groups, they really feel like full-fledged citizens, where they can express what they feel and that their opinions are counted. Two, and maybe most importantly, these are relatively open groups with weak ties, where you have members from different parts of society, different ethnic groups, different socioeconomic networks. And so they have potentially this ability to play this bridging function that's been identified by scholars of social capital in other contexts. Thirdly, they demonstrate positive norms of reciprocity. There's a lot of sharing, self-help funds, support for members who are going through crises. And they also yield positive benefits for members. So this could be access to information, job opportunities, even brokering marriages between different families that are participating in the Gran. Fourth, unlike some of the other groups that I mentioned in the OECD context, where we might only meet once a month, these groups are meeting frequently. They're spending substantial face-to-face time. I think once I show you the descriptive statistics on the next slide, you'll see that over 75% of them are meeting daily. Not everybody's attending all of these daily meetings, but it suggests that they might have the frequency and the salience to really matter. And I just conclude by saying, again, forecasting some of the data will show that our census data suggests that, at least in the two urban areas we're studying, the capital of Bamako in Mali and a regional capital of Mopti, over 60% of males aged 18 to 45 are members of these groups. So they're fairly ubiquitous in Malian society. So again, to just give you a quick highlight of some descriptive data, which I will tell you about in a bit in terms of how we went about doing this. But this is a survey of 370 groups, where I'm essentially just wanted to highlight things that support the theoretical sort of the things that we'd be looking for within the theory, right? So these are these are groups characterized by diversity. So weak ties, relatively open. 85% were formed just with other neighbors on the block. And the reason that that's important is because if you look at the demographics of Bamako or Mopti, these are still extremely both socioeconomically and ethnically heterogeneous communities. So there's not self-segregation in neighborhoods because of the nature of urban planning. And I can talk more of that, or the non-planning. I can talk about more of that in the Q&A. Secondly, only about 50% have membership where half of the members are from the same ethnic group. So at least 50% have no ethnic majority within them. So that suggests quite a bit of ethnic diversity. I think this is really interesting. So within, we conduct the survey about 2 years after the height of population displacement because of the conflict in Mali. And within that 2-year timeframe, 14% of groups had absorbed displaced people. So this just sort of demonstrates the welcoming nature of these groups to integrate new members from society. 33% of members of these groups are from the north of the country, which is an important cleavage, again, that I can address in the Q&A. But we do have some limitations in that these are mostly male groups. And 56% are only men and 78% are mostly men. And I'm happy to talk a little bit about gender in the Q&A, but I recognize upfront that this is a deficiency, so that when I talk about civil society association life, I'm really, really focused today on youth males in an urban context. Finally, 27% of these groups have a Christian member, which is really interesting given that the percentage of Christians in Mali is less, I'd say less than 10%. So there's some religious diversity. And another way we try to get at religiosity or mixed opinions about religion is asking the Muslim majority groups, what do you think, and how do you think an ideal wife should dress? You know, essentially how veiled should she be or not? And we find really mixed opinions within groups on that question. So again, all of these just to signal that there's ideological and demographic diversity within these groups. Second, they exhibit these positive norms of cooperation. You can see here, 88% provide some kind of financial help towards members. Some provide financial support services. Some provide individual contributions, job opportunities. That FaceTime statistic, as I said, 75% have daily meetings. And while the egalitarianism data that I'm presenting here are maybe a bit misleading in that most do have a member, and that member is probably the one that's paying for the tea, or a leader, sorry, that leader's probably paying for the tea most of the time. But if you look at the norms of exchange in these groups, which I've sat in on extensively, it's very open, very democratic, where every member has a right to say their piece and also to disagree with something that's already been said. Okay, so as I alluded to before, we have this issue, which is we want to look at organic groups. We don't want to go to an experimental lab and then create a group, which would give us a lot of control, right? But we lose out on the sort of the groupness, the reciprocal actions, the trust and the relationships that develop over time that we think are critical, right, for fostering this kind of bridging. So we're going to take on this difficult challenge of researching organic groups, understanding that we have a huge indigeneity problem, and we have to try to figure out ways that we can separate what might be going on inside the groups to create trust from any kind of self-selection into these groups. And so we're going to do so by drawing on sort of a wide breadth of mixed methods data to try to triangulate, to attack this question from a couple different angles. Within our analysis, we're going to use propensity score matching of members and non-members to try to anticipate some of the individual level characteristics that might explain trust and trustworthiness. We're going to explore variation in outcomes by the characteristics of the Gran. So is it that those that are more, that foster greater reciprocal relationships create better outcomes for trust and trustworthiness? Are the more diverse groups better at facilitating these outcomes? We're also going to look at individuals' experience in these groups. So if I benefited from a loan, or somebody came in and helped pay for a funeral or my marriage when I really needed help, does that then make me, does that experience within the group then make me more trusting and trustworthy? We're going to look at behavior in the games, and we're going to compare them to some real world outcomes as measured through the individual survey that we did. And then finally, we're going to draw on transcripts from 69 transcribed focus groups, where we're going to trace mechanisms of generalized trust formation within the qualitative data. Oops. So just a quick overview of the research timeline. This project's based on 18 months of fieldwork that I did with some of my co-authors in Mali. This just breaks down, I'm not going to cover this in greater depth, but happy to answer in the Q&A, the different steps we had to go through because these groups are so informal. There's no roster, there's no register, right? So we had to first sort of do ethnographic observation to define a concept of what is a Gran, as opposed to just friendship or a more formal association. So really nailing down the conceptual definition of these groups. And then we had to identify these groups. And so we did so by first doing a household census, asking for all members of the household and whether between 18 and 45, whether they were members and non-members. Then doing, as I mentioned, organizational surveys of these groups and surveys of members and non-members. And again, happy to talk more about sampling process and all of that stuff in the Q&A. We also complement this, as I said, with the focus group data that was conducted at the end. So to look at trustworthiness, trust and trustworthiness, we're going to rely on trust games, which are widely used in economics and political science. Some of you are probably already familiar with these games, but just a quick walkthrough for those who might not be. In the games, we're measuring two distinct outcomes. So with the sender, so the first person who gets the first play, we're trying to measure trust. With the receiver, the person who gets the second play, we're trying to measure trustworthiness. So the way this would work is if I take Paolo, I'm going to give him an option, and I'm going to convert this to dollars just to make it easy for everyone's brain this morning. I'm going to give Paolo either 0 or I'm going to give him $3. And he has a choice. I'm going to say he's playing with Lupe. And he has a choice to give Lupe 1, 2, 3, or none of those dollars. And whatever he decides to give to Lupe, I'm going to triple. So Paolo gives $3, I'll make it 9. If he gives 2, I'll make it 6. He gives 1, I'll make it 3. Whatever he doesn't give, he keeps for himself, right? And then he's going to give the money to Lupe. Lupe will understand what he did and then get a play back to Paolo. So Lupe's play isn't conditional on anything. She just gets the money and says, oh, this is what Paolo chose to give to me. This is what I'm going to give back. So in doing so, we're trying to measure those two distinct concepts of trust, which is relational. You're thinking a bit about the actions of the next player, and trustworthiness, which is really just a reaction to someone, let's say, gifting you more than half of their money. You might be prompted to say, man, I should really pay them back. And so we're looking at, again, trust and trustworthiness. In the setup I just gave you, Paolo knew the identity of Lupe. Lupe knows Paolo. They work closely together. I'd expect that they'd maximize the returns to the game. And that Paolo would, I don't know, Paolo, would you give Lupe all the money? Yeah. And then Lupe's probably going to pay Paolo back. But in our context and in most of these trust games, you don't know the identity of the person you're playing with, right? And so we're going to manipulate some of the information about how much you know about that person in order to better capture this concept of generalized trust. So we play 1,300 games. These are a lot of games because in order to play the game, you need two people. So that's like 2,600 players. And as I mentioned, we have embedded an experiment in the game to get a better understanding of generalized trust. So one tricky thing about measuring trust towards others is you don't really know who people are thinking about when they give you that rating of trust towards others, right? Is it my neighbor? Is it the person I just saw on TV? Who's your reference point? So in this experiment, we're trying to direct people towards 3 different reference categories. One, people are told that they're playing with another Malian. 2, they are told that they're playing with someone who speaks the same language as they do at home. And 3, they're told they're playing with someone who speaks a different language. And so we use language or linguistic cleavages in part because Mali is a multi-ethnic society. Many of the ethnic groups use a market language, and some continue to use a more minority indigenous language. And so we actually we thought that language would play a more important role in signaling insider-outsider cleavages than ethnicity. And I'm happy to talk more about why we made that bet in the Q&A. Secondly, this treatment also allows us to pragmatically do the hard work of trying to match people with others who actually fit the criteria we're describing. So we want to be ethical. We don't want to be deceptive. We don't want to tell someone they're playing with somebody of a different identity and then not really follow through and give them that true partner. Everyone's playing with someone who embodies the real characteristics of their partner in this game. So again, everyone's playing with a stranger. So if you're a member of a Gran, we're going to compare how you play with these 3 categories of strangers to non-members, how they play with these 3 categories of strangers. So in doing so, again, we're going to ask, is membership in these informal clubs associated with greater generalized trust and trustworthiness? And so we anticipate, because of all the reasons I just told you, that members of these groups are going to give more in the trust games, both as senders and receivers. Secondly, the groups that embody those characteristics that are associated with generating generalized trust, we think perhaps they'll give more. So if we look at a subsample of just members of these groups, those members in the groups that really embody the characteristics we're talking about should give more. Relatedly, people who've benefited personally from a Gran, we'd think, oh, maybe that heightened salience of experience, they're going to give more in the game. So I'm going to present some results first of the propensity score matching, and then talk a little bit about the individual level variation. And then I'm going to go over some observable implications of our theory, looking at the correlation between how people did in the games and how they report acting in real life. We want to know, right, that the behavior in the games is related to some kind of real world phenomena. So this is sort of a gut check to say, okay, so if you're acting trustworthy in the games, does this map onto any kind of real world behavior? Secondly, I'm going to go through some of the focus group data pretty quickly to try to show you some evidence where we think bridging is actually happening. So I don't have a ton of time, but I'll just tell you very quickly with these propensity score matching results that we measure our outcome variable 3 different ways. So first is the first column, did people give anything at all? So was their contribution greater than 0? And I should say the panel A, that's the role of the sender. So that was Paolo in my example. Panel B is Lupe in my example, the receiver, where we're measuring trustworthiness. And so the outcome variable is, did you give anything? The middle would be, what did you give as a percentage of the endowment that you received? And last is, did you give more than your than 50% of what you were endowed? So we sort of have the extensive margins. And then for when I describe the results, I'm really going to focus on that middle column, percentage of endowment, as the most sort of precise measure we think of if you gave more. And where I'll just direct your attention to now is if you look at the stars, if you're looking for significance, the focus is really on trustworthiness. So let me turn to the next slide and I'll translate some of these findings for the non-statistical folks in the room. So the question, do members act in a more trusting and trustworthy in the game? And what we see is that membership is very correlated with greater trustworthiness. However, not trust. So it's really correlated with, positively correlated with actions as the player B, as the receiver, but not as player A, the sender. And so translating this, membership is correlated with a 12% increase in what you would give as a percentage of your endowment when you play the role of player B. And this increased trustworthiness works across all the treatment. So whether you're playing with a Malian, whether you're playing with someone who speaks the same language or a different language at home. And it remains significant with these different measures of the outcome variable, with giving more than 0, giving over 50%, or as I said before, the percentage of your endowment. So secondly, we're going to quickly look at variation in the Gran characteristics or individual experience. Just a summary again of the types of things that we're looking for, because I'm not going to show you the full regression chart here. But we're looking at a subsample. So here we're going from 1,300 games to a focus on around 700 games. And so among the subsample of people who are members, we don't really find a ton of compelling evidence for what we're anticipating. I've highlighted in bold the findings that are consistent with our predictions, that receiving a job does make you more likely to, but this is in the role of player A, give money, hence sort of represents trust here. But in terms of trustworthiness, remember, that's where all the action was in terms of what Gran seemed to be doing or what they're correlated, what membership is correlated with in the exercise I just showed you. Here we see very mixed results. Particularly important or striking to me is the fact that when you have more displaced people if you're in a group with people who've been displaced from conflict, this is associated with 11% less giving. And then we sort of have a mixed record on financial services and loans, which we can talk about. But essentially the takeaway from this slide is we don't get a lot as we try to sift through variation within Gran membership. And that might be in part because we just don't have enough variation, that most of these groups are behaving in the way that theoretically we would expect they do. Hence, it's hard to parse it out and find variation among these groups. Then, as I mentioned, we're going to check correlations of stated behavior and attitudes. So we asked a couple different things, whether trust and trustworthiness maps on to reported volunteering or public goods provision in the neighborhood, which we have some pretty good evidence that suggests that yes, it does, both in terms of the play of player A mapping onto volunteering in the neighborhood, the play of player B, trustworthiness, and the number of hours they report helping friends or hours they report helping or volunteering in the neighborhood. Trustworthiness maps really nicely onto stated trust, how much you say you trust different groups, as well as tolerance, measured in your willingness to marry someone from a linguistic group. And then we looked at the type of Gran, again, that you're a member of. And if your Gran does public goods activities, that tends to map onto your giving in the trust game, both as a player or a sender and a receiver. All right, so now I want to pivot and look a little bit at the qualitative evidence. Here, I'm drawing on focus group data from 69 organic these are out of sample groups. So these are groups that weren't in our survey. And this was conducted in the fall of 2015 with approximately 330 what I call active respondents. So if you look at the constitution of these focus groups, what I mean by focus group is we're asking a Gran for permission to come join a meeting and pose some questions. So we're capturing the audience of people who are already there. So while 330 people spoke up and voiced an opinion, there's a much bigger group of people there. And I'm happy to speak more to those dynamics. So I'd say maybe 1,000 folks were in the focus groups, but I'm emphasizing the 330 respondents. The focus groups were recorded in local language, primarily Bamana, and then translated and transcribed into French. We did the coding exercise twice to check for reliability, and this resulted in 250 pages of single-spaced transcripts. And just to give you some of the ideas of what we were asking, we're asking about what role do Gran play in Malian society? Do Gran contribute to social cohesion, or can Gran divide people by creating solidarity between some and then distrust and social distance among others? And so in reading through all of these transcripts, what I'm looking for is to see whether or not I'm looking at each transcript and saying, do I see evidence of bridging? So not just trust formation within the group, but are they making some reference to that trust translating across broader social or societal networks? And in 61 of 66 focus groups, I find that there is mention of this bridging mechanism and broader social cohesion. So I've just thrown up some citation or quotations to give you a sense of what these mechanisms look like in the qualitative work. If we look at respondent 2, you see the emphasis on this brings our respective families closer together and creates social solidarity among us and our families. So you can imagine if you have members from different ethnic group, different socioeconomic strata, this merger of the different networks is part of what the social capital theorists think is pushing generalized trust. Here's another one that talks about consolidating social kinship, people from different regions of the country sharing this deep social bond, and then it consolidates social relationships beyond, again, membership in the Gran. I want to highlight also just quickly something unexpected that we found. So in addition to this bridging mechanism that we were testing each focus group transcript for, there was an additional mechanism that we found that is very linked to the Malian context. So this is something if you're thinking about, hey, research team, how generalizable are these findings? This specific finding might be very much tied up to Malian social culture because it's an explicit reference to cousinage or saninkuyu. So this conflict mitigation mechanism that's embedded in social governance dating back hundreds and hundreds of years. And I can elaborate more on this in the Q&A. So again, a quick recap of the findings. Membership is associated with greater trustworthiness, but not necessarily trust. We have some mixed and unexpected results within the subsample of members of these groups. We do see significant positive correlations with other outcomes of interest that we would expect should map on to trust and trustworthiness. And we found a bunch of qualitative evidence of bridging, but also Gran as a venue to practice saninkuyu, this social norm of cross-cutting cleavages and conflict mitigation. So with this paper, we think we're making 3 contributions. One is the suggested mixed methods evidence that membership, associational membership, can actually generate generalized trust. Two, we're offering a descriptive contribution of civil society in urban Africa and social capital in the global South. And we've sort of an optimistic finding that these youth, primarily youth groups, can actually generate social capital and social trust for the broader environment. And third, we're bringing trust games to an urban youth context, and we're demonstrating how the gameplay there can map onto other behavior. So I think we're left with, or there are at least two things that I'm currently thinking a lot about now as we're writing up this paper for submission. One is how much of the story is specific to Mali? So can we find pockets of urban civil society that look a lot like Gran? So we have these two mechanisms, one Sanankuyu, which seems pretty specific to countries that were formerly within the boundaries of the Malian Empire. But then we have this bridging process that I think could broadly work in other contexts in sub-Saharan Africa in these urban social clubs. And I'm already thinking there's some evidence out there of fadas in Niger or citizen forums in Cote d'Ivoire that might be consistent with this idea of a really diverse informal network or club that could bridge networks. And the second is about this distinction between trust and trustworthiness. I think still we tend to talk about generalized trust when our findings, and actually quite a few findings from the literature, suggest that the action is in trustworthiness. It's how people act when there's no relational calculation. It's how people act in order to demonstrate that future interactions can be trusted. So I'll end there. Thank you so much for your time. And I'll open things up to Q&A and stop sharing my screen.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Jaimie. Fascinating. So the floor is open. You feel free to just raise, use the little raise blue hand function, or to post things in chat if you'd like me to transmit the question for you on your behalf. Maybe I'll get us started, Jaimie, first. I'm especially interested by the problem that you raised right at the start about potential endogeneity and how you control for those things. And I keep, sort of thinking back to questions in my mind about what might be the explanatory factors for participation to begin with. Mm-hmm. And one thing that is mentioned in some of the qualitative data later is the connection between the Gran and families mm-hmm. on the back end. So I'm wondering if, sort of what your perceptions and what your data or just your, sort of awareness of the situation might suggest about the relationship between the Gran and family ties and family cohesion and family relations, especially intergenerational ones. Are the Grans sometimes intergenerational within the same family and or not? I mean, how do existing family structures and ties feed into or not the creation and dynamics of the Gran?
Great. Paolo, do you want me to go one by one or field some questions?
Well, you want to take a few at a time?
Whatever.
It looks like there are a number of questions. So I've got Clemens, Gary, and then Patrizio.
Okay, so thank you. Jaimie, thank you. That was fascinating. I think I have two questions. One is, I think I remember that 27% of the Gran members are Christians. Mm-hmm. And the percentage of Christians in Mali is obviously much, much lower. And what would explain that? And would it have an impact on the culture in those associations? And the second question is about leadership. I mean, you mentioned that there is some kind of leadership, the one who pays for the tea mostly, but in a rather informal way, and there's a democratic structure. But are there different, cultures of leadership, and would they have an impact on the culture of trust within those associations? Thank you.
Thanks.
Gary, go ahead.
So mine is a little bit of a follow-up to Paulo's question, but also more generally, as Jaimie knows, I'm quite interested in sort of multi-method research, and particularly I'm really interested these days in using these focus group and qualitative interviews for causal inference. And so one of my questions as a follow-up on Paulo's is, did you focus specifically on endogeneity kind of concerns in the focus groups, or say, like, why did you join this Gran? And other things that might give you some qualitative sort of information about this endogeneity question. So I've got other things we can talk about later, but let me just leave that as one of the sort of causal inference questions I was wondering if you explored in the qualitative part.
Mm-hmm.
Jaimie, why don't we start with those three,
okay.
And then I'll go to Patrizia and
Patricia's searing question. I'm just kidding. Great. Okay. So I'll go in the order that they came in. These are really great questions. So Paulo asks about family ties. And so sort of related to Gary's question, when so we have a bunch of data here, right? And so when we talk to so in the individual surveys, we ask a question about group formation. So how the groups were formed. And so in a minority of instances, these are family groups. So these are groups of people from the same hometown region and who are now gathered in urban areas. But the vast majority, I think I showed that, I'm not going to pull my slides up again just because of the time constraint, but we had 85% that are members because of the neighborhood. So we asked that, like, how did this group get formed? And our sense is that it's people from the same neighborhood block joining. Something I didn't talk about, but comes through explicitly in the qualitative data, is the fact that these groups, there's some age variation, but they tend to resemble sort of age grade cohorts rather than very intergenerational groups. And the way that youth would describe it is, Somali, like a lot of countries in West Africa at least, is a gerontocracy. Youth are excluded from formal politics. Youth are largely excluded from the economy. I mean, they really fight to have their voices heard. And by youth, I mean not just age, but also whether or not you're married and sort of social status. So a lot of times in the focus group transcripts, we hear people, and this is veering off in another direction, not as relevant for the paper, but we hear people talking about these Gran as critical to their psychological fulfillment as democratic citizens. That essentially these are the venues where they feel heard and respected, as opposed to home, where they don't necessarily have the power to navigate that hierarchy as well. So I guess that's what I'd say in response to you, Paulo, is that, and I guess this relates a little bit to Clemens's leadership question, is that we could look for some age variation. We actually have data on the age of all the members. That might be something interesting. But my sense is, as a trend, more generally, while there's some variation in age, it's probably truncated around a 10, 12-year band that makes these people more similar in terms of going through life stages than mixed. Paulo, I don't know if that sufficiently answers.
Yeah, thank you. Very interesting. Okay.
Okay, so Clemens, the data that I put up were maybe a little bit misleading in that I said that of the groups, the 370 groups, 27% of those groups have a Christian member. It might be one member out of 50 people. So all I was emphasizing there is the openness and not necessarily the religious composition. Because in Mali, Muslim Christian cleavage isn't really politically salient. People are huge fans of, and typically, if you look at sort of Afrobarometer data, there's very high ratings for Christians across a Muslim majority population. That's not the cleavage where we think the action would be. We think the action would more be in interreligious stuff, which is actually pretty complicated because it doesn't even map well onto Salafi, Sufi. It's like really in the weeds in terms of clientelist networks. So religion wasn't necessarily the place where we thought the cleavages would lie. We were looking really at ethnicity and primarily language as the potential cleavages. Your culture of leadership question is really interesting, and that's why on the survey we tried to get at this a couple ways, both financially, who pays for the tea, but then we also had that statistic, if you remember, about is there a vote on new members?
Yep.
And so about half of the groups, we unfortunately didn't find any of the leadership variables, at least how we've measured and operationalized them, to be significant. So I guess the question would be going back into the data and seeing if there's anything else about norms that we could throw in. But my sense is, I don't know that our survey does a good enough job tapping into that kind of stuff to really tell.
Thank you.
Okay, and then Gary, Yes, thank you, Gary. Working with you has inspired me for sure for like digging into these mechanisms within qualitative work. We did not ask explicitly in the focus groups about why people joined. We asked in the individual surveys about why they joined, and we played around. And Jacopo, I don't know if you want to step in or say anything about our various attempts to like address this endogeneity question. But in the survey, we're definitely anticipating like, okay, can we use the neighborhood joiners versus the family joiners, like the different reasons that people might join, anticipating that the neighborhood's more a convenience thing. You sort of live around the corner. Could we do that? Could we use that as a way to look at self-selection? Could we look at neighborhood composition and the composition of the groups to see how things look? We know actually, we don't present this data in this paper, but Jacopo went through a very extensive exercise looking at neighborhood composition, the demographics from the census compared to demographics of these groups. And on average, these groups are more diverse than the neighborhoods, which doesn't help us in terms of the self-selection because people seem to be selecting into groups that are more diverse. We looked at sort of length of exposure to treatment and couldn't find anything there. So I'm going to go back to the qualitative data soon, and maybe I can think about what other tests we could throw in. The problem with the focus group setting is just that there's so many respondents. So I think on average we have, from 8 to 20 people sitting around. So people, rather than everybody getting to the personal story of how I joined, the best data to capture that would probably be in the survey, which is more truncated just because it's these individual responses.
Excellent, thank you. Okay, we have Patrizio and then Marian.
So great, thanks. This is very interesting. I one follow up on Gary's question. I wonder if you can sort of combine the qualitative stuff with the PSM, with the propensity score match. I mean, and I guess that's where Gary's going. If the qualitative stuff gives you some idea of what creates the selection, and then if you have some observable variables that speak to that, maybe you can increase the matching. And to me, that's a promising avenue to reduce the endogeneity. I don't know how much you can do exposed. I mean, ideally, you would have done this before collecting the baseline so that you can collect the baseline on the basis of your qualitative evidence. And in fact, I think the new trend in both economics and political science is to do qualitative before and after the experiments, before for the sign and after for the kind of mechanism explanation. So this is very much at the frontier of social science. So I really enjoyed it. So I'm just throwing it out there. I don't know how much you can do exposed, but just a comment. And then maybe you said it and I missed it, but I was expecting a bit of a story on why you have the result on player B, but not on player A. So why would sending back respond more than giving in the first place? Can you tell us a little more what different sort of subtle difference there are in this type of trust? As you say, the literature puts everything together. So here you have a contribution, I think, potentially of splitting in two different types of trust. One, you have an effect, one you don't. If this was to an economics journal, you would do your whole paper on that. And why one has an effect, why doesn't. Yeah. But of course, you have to be convincing. So can you tell us your guess and what does that add to the literature?
Sure. Paolo, do you mind if I jump on this first before going to Marianne, just because there's a lot? And
absolutely, Jaimie, whatever's best for you.
Jacopo, do you mind? I'll respond to the second question. Do you mind jumping in on sort of how we came up with the criteria for the matching and the way that maybe we use the household census? Just to quickly address the latter half of the question about trust and trustworthiness, I think our findings are actually really consistent with what the experimental literature or within economics, how people describe measurement challenges of trust and trustworthiness. So there's a critique of the measure of trust within the trust game, that it's really hard, right, to pull out things like altruism because trust is relational. So we do try to do that by having that within, like we have some measures of altruism that we throw in the matching, but it's still, I think people generally think of it as a worse measure, and B, if you look at the other papers that have looked at the correlations with real world outcomes, I'm thinking like Tang 2011, they find it the correlation with trustworthiness and not trust. So I think we're consistent with this question. And I think, so theoretically, I think relational trust and making guesses about what we do with people and based on who they are, and that's sort of strategic thinking, is really different than this idea of a social norm, trustworthiness, that we should sort of execute and employ and embody in our daily lives. That really is the motor, is the engine, if you look at some political theorists, of these future reciprocal actions, that people are thinking of past experiences. Did that other person act in a trustworthy way? And if the answer is yes, that's really the thing that's moving us forward in terms of social thinking about this concept of trust. So Jacopo, I'll turn things over to you about PSM, if that's okay.
Yeah, thank you for the interesting questions. Of course, PSM is not ideal as an identification of causality, but that's what we can do with one round and a very rich questionnaire. And actually, most of you will know, right, that there is a trade-off when you use PSM between the balance of, treatment and control after the matching and the many characteristics and many information that you want to throw in the PSM, in the propensity score. So basically what we do here is a selection of variables that we thought were kind of interesting and suggested by the literature from one side, suggested, let's say, from the qualitative evidence on the other, in order to come up with a precise and robust PSM. And it's shown in the paper that, for example, this PSM survives to different specification of the algorithm and survives to assumption on the structure of the omitted variable and the strength of the omitted variable for when it is significant. On the other side, you wanna have balance, and if you throw many variables, as many as you can, and really our questionnaire was really rich, we end up with non-balance, so the quality of match decreases, and it's not good at neither. So it's a difficult balance to keep, and we want to, yeah, that's why we cannot have so many variables in the PSM. But I think we are targeting the right variables.
I'll just quickly add that in the household census data, right, we do have some basic characteristics on members and non-members. So we have a sense of where they differ from that sample.
Yeah, sure,
that's something that we also thought about as we were doing the PSM.
Great. Okay, we have 2 more questions left and 5 minutes. So just enough time to squeeze these in. We'll take a question from Marian and then from Sandra.
All right, thank you. Thanks for a very interesting talk, and apologies for joining a bit later. So I'm going to go in a bit of a different direction with my question. I do research with regards to social networks in health. And there's some evidence for how participation in groups, social cohesion and bridging factors can sometimes influence health and health outcomes. So I'm curious as to if there were any organic conversations about health that occurred, or if you saw, or how you saw the role of some of these groups in facilitating health outcomes, if they had those conversations, or if that was something that you were all measuring, or if there were even any conversations about payments for health challenges among Gran members. Can you speak to any of that, please?
Thanks. And Sandra, go ahead and pose your question too.
Sorry, thank you. I really enjoyed the presentation. As Patricia was saying, I mean, mixing qualitative data and experimental is the right thing to do. So I really liked it. It's just two short comments. One is, I think I missed it, so it's an easy one. The using qualitative data to measure trustworthiness. Did you really measure trustworthiness in the focus groups or in the? I think I missed it, and that could be a very important contribution to complement the experimental data. And the second one is about external validity. Any referee will actually ask you about that, and with your answers in the questions, I saw that you are very careful and thoughtful with the experimental literature. but it will be nice to have to know or to place the point that you get in terms of trust and trustworthiness in your study in the field compared to other studies that have done lab in the field experiments in developing countries to measure trust and social capital. There are a bunch of them, but it still will be good to actually put it in the map and also maybe use part of the results of these other studies to explain the problem you have with altruism mixed with the trust, since you didn't run the trust game. It will be very helpful.
Great. So Jaimie, if you want to address those, and Jacopo, if you'd like, and any final comments you want to make too.
Sure. Jacopo, did you want to jump in on any of those? Okay. So then very quickly, so Marian, thank you for your question. Yes, so we were really interested in how these groups support members in terms of networks of reciprocity and also positive benefits, because we thought that's a key area that the literature suggests that needs to happen in order for them to transfer this trustworthiness to a broader audience. So in doing so, we were looking at things like financial support at times of crisis. So when we go back and we look at responses between, this is just on the individual survey, but we compare members to non-members, we see that members are much less likely to suffer economic shock. And we think that a lot of that is because they have those mechanisms within Gran to pull funds. And whether it's through a loan, through sort of financial emergency support or another mechanism, as I showed in the data, this is a pretty frequent, I think 88% of these groups had these help funds, right? And so these help funds go exactly to the things that you're talking about, major life events, so baptisms, weddings, and funerals, and then health emergencies. So Mali's, I think, in the bottom 10, maybe bottom 5 in terms of human development indicators. It's one of the poorest countries in the world. And so absolutely the pooling of resources is critical for access to medical care. So yes, I would say that through these mechanisms, members of these groups perhaps have more ability to sort of mobilize funds than somebody without this similar kind of social capital would outside of family. I mean, there's a lot of family mobilization, so I can't totally separate out or say that these weigh more or count more than family mobilization of medical funds, because that's still, Mali's a very sort of collectivist society in the sense that there's a lot of risk sharing across family units. Mm-hmm. So that's a major part of the structure, but then there's maybe a small value added of also being able to turn to this network for medical support and help. Sandra, I think that's a great comment and something I haven't done with the qualitative data to like conceptually go look. So in the ethnographic study, we were really focused on trust and trustworthiness. So early on when we were just observing Gran, thinking about those conceptualizations, but I haven't gone through the focus group data with an eye towards like that conceptual distinction. And I think that's a great comment. The second point on, well, you were asking about other labs in the field. And yes, this is a big and growing literature in economics. There's been a lot done with trust games in different settings. And one of the theoretical tie-ins that I think is more pronounced in the paper is what's our contribution specifically in dialogue with that sort of trust game literature in the field. I think we're distinct in that we're, and I'd love thoughts if you have good citations that we should think about, but at least in the context of sub-Saharan Africa, most of that work has been in rural settings. So the fact that we're bringing this to urban settings with a youth, sort of a youth component looks a bit different from what we've seen so far.
Well, fantastic. Thank you, Jaimie. Thank you, Jacopo. This has been a really rich hour, wonderful for the Ford program as a whole, and as well as for each of us who had the privilege of participating today. So thanks above all to the two of you, but thanks to everybody who took time at this busy end of semester time to participate today. This is the last of our Ford research seminars for the semester, but we are already hard at work planning another pair of them at least for the spring semester. So be on the lookout for those, and have a wonderful day, everybody. Thank you again.